Ready. I think we'll go ahead and kick it off. I see that number of attendees still growing, so people can tune in as we're getting going here. So welcome to the API Governance with Postman webinar. My name is Ken Lane. I'm the Chief Evangelist at Postman. My role here at Postman is to help our enterprise customers realize their API lifecycle and think more critically about API governance and how they can improve and deliver APIs more consistently across teams. So let's start with a couple housekeeping items. Everyone's muted. You can ask questions under the Q&A, and then towards the end, my panelists, my fellow Postmanauts are going to help curate some of the questions. And then at the end, we're going to dive in and do some Q&A. So this will all be recorded, and then we'll publish it to YouTube for you all to consume later. And so if you miss any piece of it, if you have to step away, it will be recorded and you can tune in later. And then at the end also, I'll share a URL with you, and you can take a brief survey and enter to win an Amazon gift card. So here's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to roll you through, give you kind of an intro to what is API governance, talk about design governance and how you can measure and automate that, and then ultimately report on it. And then I want to kind of zoom out and show you how you can evolve your API governance strategy beyond just the core API design, which is the most common interpretation. So let's start out. What is API governance? I think it means a lot of things to a lot of different folks. So let's just start by kind of laying some basic definition of what it is. So ultimately, governance is providing guidance for teams when it comes to delivering APIs and really using consistent design patterns across those APIs, but also employing a common schema that you use as part of those requests and response. And then it's about really establishing a machine readable set of rules that you can use to validate that those patterns are actually in use and in play. And really working to deliver a consistent experience across all your users and actually having a plan for how you're going to measure and define success and understand the outcomes of all of this effort. So we're going to give you a little look into that world today. So around 2000, we started seeing this new type of API emerge, leveraging on HTTP and the web that was evolving. Those early pioneers were eBay, Amazon, and Salesforce. But here in 2020, there are just a real explosion of APIs. There are so many APIs, and they're behind all of those applications that we're familiar with. From Reddit to GitHub to Amazon Alexa, there's APIs behind all of those web, mobile, and device applications that we're working with in our personal and professional worlds. But if you've been in the API space for any amount of time, then you know that a lot of these APIs aren't always the best designed, best supported and operated APIs. They're really, the bulk of them are pretty difficult to use. Now, there are quite a few gems out there. There's quite a few APIs like Stripe and Twilio and others that are shining examples of how we can do APIs. But within the enterprise, amongst our partners and out in the public space, there are plenty of APIs that are just difficult, hard to use. They're broken. Authentication is hard. There's just many ways that they can cause problems. So all of this really becomes evident within your organization and as you work externally between the producers of those APIs and the consumers of the APIs. This is the biggest disconnect in the space because providers are usually kind of behind a firewall. They don't always have direct engagement with the consumers. And so a lot of things can get out of sync in this environment. You know, there's a lot of bugs. There's a lot of different development tools being used to deliver APIs. And on the consumer side, it's really hard to get started with the API. It's hard to onboard with it. The documentation can be out of whack and not up to date. And just things are just generally hard and buggy. But what we're going to focus on today is this piece here. is governance and the lack of it, and how there's a lot of pieces of governance in play out there already, but we just got to work to get a little bit more organized about how we're doing our governance. So all of this challenge with delivering APIs and consuming APIs that companies are realizing over the last 5 to 10 years as they've kind of embarked on this API journey has led to a whole bunch more of investment in API governance. This is really the top topic that I'm having conversations with our customers, and I'm hearing from people is there's just not any coherent strategy for how to do governance. And from the top down, leadership's starting to realize this, and they're really making an investment in understanding what is governance, defining it, and doing a lot better. So as part of this journey, we've been talking to our customers over the last 5 years and bringing new features into Postman. And once we added the API builder and Postman kind of moved from being more of a client tooling that you could use to work with APIs, you could actually develop and deliver APIs. We started to get more in tune with what our customers were using and doing as part of their entire API lifecycle, and setting the stage for governance. And OpenAPI was really central to this. So OpenAPI is an API specification that the Postman API builder uses as the kind of central contract. And then it uses this across the API lifecycle. And this really reflects what we're seeing across our 12 million developers. So in response to this, earlier this year, we joined the OpenAPI initiative. So we're now a member, and we have a voice in the roadmap because OpenAPI is very central to not just Postman, but central to the overall governance process. And I'll show you a little bit more about how this works in a bit. So to help kind of illustrate what I'm talking about, we've set up a reference implementation that we call Union Fashion. So it's a fictitious e-commerce company. You may have seen it in some of our previous webinars. We did a enterprise e-commerce series earlier this year, and Union Fashion was the center of that. So as I walk through the concepts of API governance here, you're going to get a little more familiar with Union Fashion and understand how this applies. But we're just using this as a reference. All of the concepts are universal and can apply to any other industry or type of API that you're delivering. So as an evangelist, I'm a developer, I'm an engineer, so I don't like spending a lot of time in the slide deck if I don't have to, but I know it's helpful to get everyone up to speed and kind of share the narrative of what I'm going to do. So let's just take a look at what I'm talking about, and let's get a little more hands-on when it comes to API governance here. So let me close this out. Let me go ahead and load up my Postman. Let me zoom in a bit because I know it can be difficult to see my screen. So I'm in Postman, desktop client here. I've created a workspace dedicated to this product API that I'm using as part of Union Fashion to show products on the website and their mobile applications in any partner or third-party developer integration. So we have a single workspace set up here that I can invite any team member to. And this is where we'll be developing the products API that drives the website. And so what I want to show here, this is kind of an intro to API governance, because I think most people don't realize they're doing API governance now. A lot of customers who come to me and ask, hey, where do we get started with this? I'm like, well, it's pretty likely you're already doing governance. You're already doing a lot of the parts and pieces. I'm guessing it's just not part of a larger strategy. And that's what we need to help more of our customers do is realize that and then start working on a common strategy. So API governance really begins with being able to find your APIs and find the artifacts and collaborate and work with team members. If you can't find your APIs, you're not going to be able to govern them. So having a dedicated workspace where you store one or many APIs you work with team members on is the foundation for API governance. And then, as I said, the OpenAPI definition, formerly known as Swagger, is something that's been evolving over the last decade. And most enterprise organizations are using Swagger or OpenAPI as the contract. And if you, in the Postman, if you go to the API builder here, I've got one API listed here, my products API. Given a dashboard, I've got lots of things I can use to manage the lifecycle of this API. But right here under define is where I'm going to find this OpenAPI contract. So OpenAPI is a YAML or JSON definition. I'm using YAML because it's a little easier on the eyes when it comes to demoing. That describes the surface area of my API. And so this gives me the ability to define the title and description of my API, tell a little bit about what it does. And then I can go into the actual details of each individual path, method, and start sharing the details of what this individual method is actually doing, providing a summary, a description, and a unique identifier. And then I can tag my APIs methods and get more organized about how I label them, how I group and organize them, helping me establish some bounded context for how we describe and define APIs. And this particular method is a post, so I've got the details of my request body here, the content type, a reference to the JSON schema that describes the product being passed here. And then here's an example of that product. I can describe the response of this API method. Again, media type, a reference to the JSON schema. And I can keep doing that with my OpenAPI, describing the different methods. Here, I'm going to get all my products. I can pass in parameters. I've got my response again. And then I can keep going, pulling individual products. I've got a put here that does the update, full or partial updates to the product. And then I can actually delete a product. And then down here under our components library, we have a handful of components, and one of them is our schemas. And this is that reference we saw above. All it's doing is referencing this JSON block or this JSON schema block here that describes the properties of the product. And this actually becomes the schema contract. So earlier when I talked about what is API governance, OpenAPI allows us to use common patterns to describe the surface area of the request and response. And it allows us to define the underlying schema that is used in those requests and responses. And so if you're doing Swagger or you're doing OpenAPI, you've got you're doing the foundation, you're laying the foundation for what is API governance, because you can't govern what you don't have defined and what you can't measure. And more importantly, as you see, what you can't measure programmatically. So OpenAPI is really core to being able to govern not just the design of the API, but the overall how that API is delivered across the API lifecycle. So this OpenAPI contract is for my products API. It describes the basic create, read, update, delete. From this contract, I'm actually versioning each part of this contract. I'm syncing it to GitHub so it can be used in other tools and systems as part of a CI/CD process. So this gives me the ability to manage change. I've got a change log here. I've got all of my versions. All of this really gives me the ability to evolve this API in a common way, a shared way with my team members and other stakeholders, and then be able to measure that and actually define that using OpenAPI. And then from this contract, I'm actually generating collections for a variety of purposes here. So I can hit generate collection. I can give this collection any name, and then I can select from a handful of purposes why I'm generating this collection: for documentation, for generating mocks and doing contract testing and other types of tests. I've already got my, my collections generated, so I'm not gonna generate those. You can find those collections over here. Go back to my collections tab, and then I've got a handful of collections that I've all generated from this OpenAPI contract. And so the first one that I've generated is for documentation. I've generated this collection, and then I click publish docs. And this gives me the ability to configure the settings and some styling, but ultimately I'm looking for this, which is the classic 3-panel API documentation that I need for my API. It's got all the examples, it's got the code snippets, it's standardized documentation. I know it's always up to date because I'm regularly publishing it from this collection. And then when that gets out of sync, I've got this develop tab here. If my OpenAPI changes and it doesn't validate against that and my documentation becomes out of date, I get notified here and I can resolve that. And so I can do the same for my mock. If I want to mock this API as I'm developing and iterating it, or just provide a mocked representation for testing, for sandbox purposes, I can generate a mock collection. I can choose to mock it here, and I can give it a name, choose an environment, and generate that. I've already got a mock server running, so I'm not going to generate that. And then I can also generate contract tests. So using Postman, I can generate this entire collection, which has requests for all of my APIs. I'm using my mock server that I generated here. I can hit send. I get a list of products. Now, I've also got a set of test results because I want to make sure that A, I'm getting back a successful status code. B, it has a body, it has a valid JSON body, but more importantly, I'm actually validating that this JSON coming back matches the JSON schema here in my contract. So I pull this JSON schema from this contract, and then I'm testing for it here as part of my test scripts in Postman here. So let me get my tabs a little better there. So here under the test scripts, I've got a variety of test scripts that I'm running to actually implement and understand whether I pass these results. So I can do this for the entire contract, and I can do this to really understand what's going on with each of these. And I've got this as a self-contained collection. Now I can do that for performance, I can do it for security testing, I can do it for integration. There's many different types of tests that I can set up. And I'm doing this as individual collections. You could do this as one collection if it's easier for you to manage. I do them separately because I like, one, for demo purposes, it helps. Two, I can run these as independently as runners. So say I want to run my contract testing, I can run it as a monitor, or I can run it manually here as a runner, and I can choose my contract tests. Let me widen my screen here a bit, and you can see I've got all of my requests selected. I can choose which environment I'm running that across. I'm going to run it against my mock, and then I can hit run, and it's going to run through and test all of those to make sure I've passed, and looks like I failed a couple. I don't have the proper status codes. It's not completely in alignment with my contract, and I can clean that up and make that work. So this is not rocket science. This is pretty run-of-the-mill Postman usage. You don't have to do this in Postman. You can do this in other tools. These are common practices that you see across other API operations enterprise organizations, is using OpenAPI Swagger, publishing docs, publishing mocks, doing contract testing. And all of that is API governance. It means you're consistently documenting, you're consistently testing your API contracts to make sure that those are working. You're running those as monitors on a regular schedule so that your contract tests come back and tell you whether they failed or not. You can run those in the CI/CD pipeline using Newman, our open source pipeline runner, and you can output the results of these tests. This is API governance. So if you're doing this across multiple APIs, so as you can see, I've got several workspaces here for many different APIs. I'm just looking at the products one. I'm doing this consistently. Every API's got its own workspace. It's got its own set of collections. It's consistently documented, mocked contract, testing the contracts. I'm versioning, we're commenting, we're managing change logs, and we're just iterating up on all of this in a standardized way. That's governance. That's pretty basic intro level governance that you can implement across your organization to start getting going. Now, when you talk to most people about what is governance, they start thinking about API design governance. That's the first thing, because that's the biggest friction area that people feel when it comes to uh, the problems across APIs. If someone's using multiple APIs from Union Fashion, they should all have expected behavior. That's why we design web APIs or HTTP or RESTful APIs, whatever you want to call them, because we're using common patterns that developers are familiar with. The reason why we use Swagger OpenAPI is because it allows us to kind of harmonize and describe and define those APIs and use our HTTP status codes in common ways. We define our paths, we define our methods, and we use our verbs in some common ways. We're very thoughtful about how and when we use the request body versus when we use our parameters, our query parameters, or our path parameters. So the process of using an OpenAPI definition is the beginning of API design governance as well, because it helps us think through why we're using certain paths, why we're using methods the way we are. Do we have all of our status codes? What's our request and response bodies look like? And it really gets us on the same page when it comes to designing and developing APIs. And if you have that in a common workspace or repository, and developers can be invited and collaborate around this, and they can make changes and comments, they can share these artifacts, but this is always where we come to centrally kind of design, define, and then ultimately govern. You're doing it. You're already off to the API governance races. So just having the OpenAPI there is the beginning of design governance for a lot of groups. And that's where I recommend everyone start. And as I'll show you in a little bit, it gets a little wider than that, what governance means. But API design governance is really where you should be building on the governance you're already doing. So with that said, how do we measure that? How do we understand and quantify that? Because we're quantifying our contracts or our implementation of the API. How do we quantify the design of our API? I mean, we have it right here as an open API. We have all the design patterns. How do we measure, test, and then ultimately automate and help us scale that governance? And there's no better way to do it than just using the exact same tools and processes that I'm using to test a single implementation. But rather than pulling the product listing and testing that, I'm going to pull this open API and I'm going to test actually the surface area of the API using the same testing tools that I just showed you. So with this said, I have a separate workspace here. It's called governance. I'm going to switch to it. This is where I have collections that live across APIs. So developers can come and grab these collections. So I've got one here called design governance. I'm going to share it to my products workspace because I'm just going to use it for a little bit. I don't need it to live in that workspace. So I'm going to share it over there. I'm going to make sure all the rules pass. And then I'm going to go back to that workspace. So now I've got my other ones, my mock, my documentation. We're just going to leave governance start up here at the top. But rather than pulling the individual APIs, I'm going to pull this open API contract and I'm going to test that because I want to make sure that the paths, all of those things are actually being used in consistent ways. And I've got an environment rather than using my mock environment. I've got a separate governance environment that I'm using. So I have environments for my development, my staging, and my production, but I also have an environment for my for the governance to help me help guide pulling of this API, because I'm going to need a Postman API key to actually pull this, and then I'm going to store the results, actually store the results in my governance environment, and I'll show you why in a little bit. So let's start with the basics. Using the Postman API, I'm going to pull this OpenAPI. So I got a request here that just goes to the Postman API. I've already got some basic settings in here, and I'm going to hit send. And so I get back from the Postman API this OpenAPI definition that I can now test. And so using Postman scripts, I'm doing exactly what I did for my API implementation, but I'm getting a set of different results. So I've got one rule defined here. I want to make sure that the title, the name of this API meets our minimum requirements, which are pretty basic. It's got to be greater than 5 and it's got to be less than 25 because we don't want any too verbose names. We want developers to think about them and make them pretty intuitive and easy to understand. And so I'm using the test scripts to do this, and it's passed. And thus, because it passed both those sides of the rule, the name meets the requirements. I can do that for the description, running the script, got some test results. Oh no, it's not greater than 100. So the developer just used a really short, sweet description of the API and really did put a lot of work into it because we don't want a novel here, but we want it to be a little bit more than just saying the title again and that it pulls from the database and some basic response. Now we could get a little bit, we could get some machine learning in here. We could get a little sentiment analysis and do a little more deep dive on the content. But this at least gets me the basics. I know my developers are naming and describing their APIs in some consistent ways. So let's go beyond the information. Let's actually look at the path. So I'm going to, again, pull the OpenAPI definition. This time I'm running tests against each individual path. So it's actually going to loop through each path, and it's going to compare against a dictionary of words. Because I want to make sure that each resource that's used as part of a path is actually a word. I don't want acronyms in there. I don't want half words. I don't want concatenated. I want actual plain language words that are meaningful to human beings. And this is a big part of RESTful API design, but also just making sure your API speaks to whoever's using it. So I'm testing the path there. Let's dive into the methods. This gets a little bit meatier here. I can actually look through all of my parameters. I have a rule where I want all parameters to be camel case. So it's actually looping through all of the query and path parameters. And here I've got a product ID, as you can see, is camel case. So these are all passing. I want to make sure that they all stick with our parameter guidelines. Then I can look, do all parameters have descriptions? Ooh, no, not too good here. I don't have all descriptions for them and they don't meet our guidelines. So they all have descriptions, but they don't meet the minimum requirements. Responses, I can make sure that we all have a 200 status code. Let me scroll out here so you can see the rules. So do we have a proper 200 status code and 500? Because at a minimum, I want every API method to have a happy path and an unhappy path. We can get more detailed when it comes to specific HTTP methods, what status codes they should be using, and having redirects, 404s, 403s, all of that. But this shows you two basic rules that I can set up. I can make sure that, whoops, I got a spelling in my name there. So you can do get, post, put, and delete. I want to make sure that we have basic CRUD capabilities for each method. Do they all have summaries, descriptions? Oh, and I want them all to have some sort of tagging and some bounded context associated with them. So I've got a whole bunch of rules that are method focused here. And then I can dive into the schema and do other things. And then I'm storing the results of this in my governance environment. So every time I run one of those, the results of them show here in the screen, but those results are actually stored here in the governance environment. And so I have this as an individual design collection. I showed you how I shared it to this workspace. Developers can grab it, move it in here, run it manually, request by rule to make sure so that they understand the rules, but also that they understand and they can fix their own OpenAPI definition and make sure it's compliant. And so that gives me a collection that can share around, but more importantly, it gives me a collection that developers can then run, again, using the same infrastructure. And widen this. So I've got all of my rules here. I can choose my governance environment. I can then hit run, and it's going to run through all of those and tell me which rules I've not met. And so it can basically go through the whole governance checklist and return to me whether we've passed or not. And so that gives developers the ability to run manually or run as a bulk, but then they can also run it as a monitor. So we can choose the design governance collection, what version we're running. I'm using the governance environment. I can set up a schedule to check regularly, and then I can run it from multiple regions if I want this to work from different locations. And so this really gives me the ability to manually run on a schedule, but then I can also use Newman, our open source collection runner, and I can run that governance as part of the CI/CD pipeline. Now, I don't recommend coming out of the gate doing that, because if you do that, you're probably gonna upset your developers. And I highly recommend just leaving it in manual mode for a while. Let your developers run, get to know what your rule set are, because that's why this is developed as a collection and set of rules. Is as a governance leadership, I can add rules, I can tweak rules, I can evolve them, remove them, make them more precise, less precise, more strict, less strict. And I can, as a coordinator, I can do that in the governance workspace, and then developers can just grab that. And it's a way of introducing them to these concepts, these rules. These are all documented just like you would any other request, but rather than calling the API again, we're just calling the OpenAPI. So by doing this, developers will get more familiar with your rules. They'll get more familiar with OpenAPI and ultimately how to apply, test, and work with these. And once your rule sets get really precise, you know, the right amount of strictness, developers are governance literate. They understand what's going on. They've seen it working. They understand how to fix problems. Then you might want to automate that and put it in the pipeline. So that really gives you a full range to be able to automate these governance collections along with your contract testing. So both of these, the contract tests and governance, I can run manually as a runner. I can set up as a monitor. I can bake them into the pipeline and using Newman, and I can further automate this to understand what's going on with my API operations. And this allows me to scale governance, the governance I'm already doing with contract testing of a specific implementation. In this case, it's a products API. I can execute and automate the governance of the design of the surface area of the API. So I'm evolving and maturing what is my governance practices when it comes to each API, and I'm doing it in a way that can be scaled across teams and can be managed centrally, but then can be implemented locally and in a distributed way by developers. And so that really gives you the overview of what is governance, you know, the state of governance today, what is design, and then here's how you can measure and report or measure and quantify that. But I've also added in another one here called reporting. And I'm just getting going with this. This is some basic examples, but this allows me to, again, pull the OpenAPI, but I'm pulling from, instead of pulling just the OpenAPI, I'm pulling the environment, because remember I stored everything here in the environment from the results. And if I hit send on this, I get back JSON, which is pulling the environment detail. But if you look at the test scripts and then you look at visualizer, I've used the test scripts here to pull the details and visualize it as an outline. So I can actually see okay, I didn't pass the descriptions, my paths are words, and I can go through all of the rules and spit them out into a single outline. And this could then be, I've got a separate method here to output this as JSON, can publish these results to GitHub. And so I can visualize them as a developer and make sure I've met my checklist. And if I haven't, I can fix them and then I can output them. And then this data can be aggregated because it's in a machine readable format. I can aggregate them as a governance compliance person across all of the APIs, across the workspaces, and be able to generate aggregate reports on what's going on and how things are doing. And that really helps me report on governance, take what we've been able to measure and actually define what is success, what is failure, how well teams are doing. I can organize this by team if I have API or teams assigned to specific APIs. So I can really start going a lot further when it comes to reporting and understanding what's going on. And so that's kind of that's where everyone I think should be striving to be in the next 5 years. Is you're already using Swagger OpenAPI. You're already consistently documenting. Hopefully you're mocking and using mocks as part of it. You have a performance and security testing strategy to make sure you meet your SLA and your other compliance requirements. And then, you know, you're doing this consistently across APIs, across workspaces. And then you bring in the design governance and you kind of step it up a notch and, hey, all of our APIs are behaving the same. They're all using status codes alike. The parameters are the same. The parameters are meaningful. And so our design governance is getting in order a lot more. But because I'm using Postman here, I've got workspaces set up, I've got docs, mocks, tests, I can actually govern the rest of the API lifecycle. All of this is available through the Postman API. Just as I showed you how I'm pulling the OpenAPI and pulling environments through the Postman API, I can pull collections and say, does each API across all workspaces have contract tests? Does it match 100% of the surface area of that contract for the OpenAPI definition? Are there tests and working? And what are the results? Are those passing or failing across those? Are teams publishing documentation? Is there up-to-date documentation for all of the APIs across teams? Are they testing for performance and security and the rest of their SLA? So I can actually start pulling artifacts, measuring them, and including them, allowing me to go much further beyond just design governance and actually govern the entire API lifecycle. I can make sure we're using workspaces. I can evaluate how people are using workspaces and then come up with those rules and then help police it and enforce it and work with teams to make sure that they're using them. I can provide guidance for mocking and documentation. I can provide guidance and examples for how tests are done, and then developers can use those. So that allows me to not just govern API design, but actually go beyond and govern the entire API lifecycle. Now, as I said, don't recommend y'all diving into this right away. I recommend you getting your bearings with the basics. Use Swagger OpenAPI consistently, document, test, mock, and deliver specific stops along the API lifecycle in a standardized and measured way. Get your bearings on API design governance. Get your bearings on how you report on that, how you police it, how you educate developers, and then start looking at, okay, how do we measure the rest of the API lifecycle? How do we do this at scale across APIs? How do we deal with legacy APIs? And you can really start going a lot further than that. So that's the big picture of API governance in the context of a Postman workspace. Being able to use Postman for everything we're doing with it today, we're documenting, mocking, and testing. We're using OpenAPI as the central truth. We're validating those against each stop along the life cycle. We're setting up monitors. We're doing all of these. We're commenting. You know, we're actually having conversations around each API. So you start by doing that, but then you can slowly kind of keep ticking the box and doing a little bit more governance beyond that. And Postman shows you how to, gives you the ability to do this. As I showed you, you can sync these to GitHub so that you know that each of these contracts are also that are tested and governed are available for use in other systems, and knowing that changes could happen to those contracts that in those places. If one of those contracts change, it'll be synced back here. We'll know that we're out of date. All of our contract tests and our governance will fail, and we can figure out where that came from in another system. So it really helps us localize, standardize, but then also deal with kind of chaos from a distributed setup that we all live in. We all live in kind of a big world where there's lots of APIs, and we don't always have the traceability and the observability to understand what's happening. And now you can observe using monitors, not just each individual API, but the design and hopefully other stops along the API lifecycle. And so that's for the products API. I'm gonna pull back, remove this governance from the workspace. I'll just poke my head real quick back into the governance workspace to show you, this is a full lifecycle governance collection that goes beyond just design to give you a kind of taste test of what else. I want to make sure APIs have a proper configuration, all the artifacts and definitions that I want. They should have a workspace. They should be part of a GitHub org and a GitHub repo. They should possess a certain number of collections and environments. Every API should have an owner. Back in the API definition, you can, oops, I don't have that API here. You can actually determine who's the contact. You can put contact information in there. So I want to make sure everything's defined. I want to make sure everything's designed, mocked, developed, deployed into production. Because I use AWS, all of my infrastructure have APIs. And so I'm actually able to identify when something's been developed, when it's been deployed. I've got timestamps. I can measure those things. So I can actually understand the velocity of a team, of a specific API, from defining and designing all the way through development and production. I can make sure they have contract tests. I can make sure we're monitoring APIs from the proper cloud regions based upon the consumers and who's using them. And I can make sure support is set up. And for these APIs, we're using GitHub issues. I can make sure licensing is in sync. And then, of course, I can report across all of this. So this is a little sneak peek into full API lifecycle governance. But it's something you can do today with Postman and with your OpenAPI Swagger. If you want to look at, let me get my browser tab here. If you want to look at how all this works, it's all the Union Fashion reference implementation. You can go to union.fashion. There's a developers area here. It's got all these APIs we're talking about. And then all of this is available on GitHub. You can find the governance collection. You can find a lot of this here. It's all work in progress. This is our kind of ongoing reference implementation. So if there's something you want to see here, feel free to leave a GitHub issue in one of these areas, and happy to answer some more questions. But with that said, let's go back to our deck here. Let me get a drink of water too. So hopefully that gave you a nice look into how to apply governance consistently across your operations. Hopefully you're already doing some of these workspace collection, documentation, mocking these common features of Postman. You already have some of that in place, some of the basis or the foundation of governance. And then all you got to do is start kind of measuring and defining and pulling that together, and then orchestrating and automating it, and it'll help you, get things more in sync, make sure things aren't breaking, making sure things are using consistent patterns, common patterns, and then your consumers are going to be a lot happier for it. They're going to definitely be a lot more pleased with you. So this should show you how the Postman platform is much more than just what you probably know it as an HTTP client. It goes beyond just what you may know as testing a single implementation, but it's actually a full life cycle solution. You can deliver multiple stops along the API life cycle. And because you can do this, and because Postman is API driven, you can measure, you can quantify and measure all of these stops along the API lifecycle, and ultimately allow you to govern individual APIs, the design of those APIs, and then how that's applied across multiple stops along the API lifecycle. And then, as I said, using monitors and runners, and then Newman to orchestrate and make sure this is done consistently across teams. There's a lot more in the Postman platform that I'm not going to go into as part of this, but there's a lot more that will enable you to be successful throughout that life cycle. So yay, we've got a products API on Postman that, or on Union Fashion, excuse me. Our products API is reliably displaying products on the website, on our mobile applications, and then to our partners and third-party developers using the developer program. And so this shows you how you can define, design, and iterate upon an API in an API first way. If you want to see how to do that, you can go back through our YouTube channel, and there's actually a series of three webinars that I did around Union Fashion that show you how to do this. How do you define and design? How do you build and develop? How do you actually go to market and deliver these into production? And then this is kind of that cherry on top of that, that sundae is API governance. Now, if you do this consistently, how do you actually govern this? And if you go back and watch those videos, you'll see how I talk about governance throughout this, and then I kind of allude to this webinar, and here we are, helping us enable, and deliver what the customers need through our products API. So with that said, that's the governance webinar. You can go to bit.ly/API governance and complete the survey to potentially win an Amazon gift card. And I'm going to leave this up for a little bit while I pull up I'm going to pull up my Slack and see what my team's saying to me. Oh, I'm good. I must have done all right because they're not yelling at me. And then I'm going to look at the Q&A list here. So go ahead and head up and start filling that survey. First, the better. Let me look at some of these questions. This is awesome. I'm reading from Mark Fowler. The define screen and APIs and the defining the structure APIs, our team build nearly all of our APIs in AWS using Lambda and API Gateway. Does a schema construct in the define screen potentially interact with API Gateway in AWS definitions? And are there good examples you can do this? So yes, so the build and deploy version of the Union Fashion e-commerce webinar series actually showed how to do this. I actually built a deployment collection that would deploy using the OpenAPI from the API builder, deploy it to the gateway, deploy the Lambdas, deploy the RDS or DynamoDB behind it. So that's one kind of proof of concept that shows you how you can use AWS APIs in Postman to actually deliver APIs. We also have an AWS integration. So if you head to the integrations page, you can see how you can actually then use AWS Gateway seamlessly with Postman as an integration to generate all of the endpoints, publish that open API. You still have to do some of the wiring up behind the scenes, but between those two should show you how you can create a lot of synergy between Postman and AWS, and specifically API Gateway. Hopefully that helps you, Mark. Great, Robert. Can you enforce consistency across an API? Insist every request object that uses products has a property called product code. That date property is always something. Oh yeah, so you start with that. Your JSON schema should have those properties. So it should have that product code property as part of that schema. And then you can use JSON schema to say, what's within bounds of being product code, minimum, max, all those JSON schema properties that allow you to kind of say, hey, this property should be like this. Then if that JSON schema, any path or HTTP method that uses that schema, if it is properly referenced as part of the OpenAPI, then those contract tests should do that. So we're not even getting into full governance. This is just basic API contract testing. And so yes, Robert, have your OpenAPI defined, make sure all of your methods are defined and have references to their schema, make sure the schema portion is very robust. And then Postman test scripts will, there's an AJV validator, JSON schema validator that you can use. And it will tell you whether that or not each API that is supposed to be using it has it or not. So that should help you get there. Let me look, read some of these. Is it possible to use a collection as a starting point to governance API? Existing as a starting point to a governance. Well, you know, I would say this is kind of a tough one. So I would say if that existing collection is testing the implementation, meaning making calls to the API itself, it's, you know, it's going to be dangerous to mix context where you're pulling and governing the surface area of that API. But you could have a folder that's part of that collection that then pulls that OpenAPI, as I showed you, and then governs the surface area. So yeah, you know, there's really nothing stopping you from crafting your API collections like that, and do that. I would be hesitant about the context switching, but it would still make for a pretty nice way of approaching this. Are the governance rules being demonstrated stored on GitHub repo? Yes, if you go to the Union Fashion GitHub org, the governance collections are part of that. And they're not, I wouldn't say ready for prime time, meaning they're documented, they kind of show you how to do it, but there's still some little nuances of how you pull the OpenAPI, how you use the environments that have to be in alignment. I'm gonna try to spend some more time kind of polishing those and getting those ready for prime time so that people can use those. Wow, and thanks to my team for marking these as live, right, as I'm answering them. You guys are awesome. Is there any documentation about API governance? No, this is, you know, what you see on GitHub is kind of our labs or our proof of concepts around how to do this. Like I said, there's still some rough edges around how you use it and how you do it. But there's not any clear documentation on API governance, and I apologize for that. And I should write more documentation. I should do more storytelling on this. I would add this, the narrative that I'm walking you through today is available on API Evangelist on my blog. You can go to apievangelist.com. Any webinar that I do, I usually tell the story like right before as a narrative, and that helps me kind of have it on the tip of my tongue. So you can go there to my blog. I talk a lot about how I'm thinking about governance, but I apologize. With Postman, we're working on a section of documentation dedicated to this, working on polishing the collections, and then I promise I will do some more storytelling on the blog around it as well. I would like to build OpenAPI spec visually. Hand editing YAML is not very efficient. Yes, I agree. There are times I love my artisanal handcrafted OpenAPIs, but there are a handful of tools out there. I think API's Guru, they have a OpenAPI GUI editor that you can use. So just Google OpenAPI visual editor. I know I've written a couple stories about and roundups of what visual tools are available out there. And then also make sure you go to the Postman Labs GitHub app support GitHub repo and start a GitHub issue asking for this, because we're We're really rolling in a lot of new features when it comes to our OpenAPI editor. We just added validation where you can validate them. And there's a lot of different ways that we can go when it comes to improving the ability to edit an OpenAPI. And I would love to have a visual editor in the tool, but I need your help to kind of add the issues, vote it up, and make sure that it gets included in as part of the roadmap, because that's how we do things at Postman. That's how the roadmap works. So would you recommend any resource to understand more about API governance beyond playing around with stuff in Postman? Yeah, there's a lot of academic thought out there. This is one of the reasons I joined Postman. This is the first time that I've been able to get hands-on with it. So there's not a lot of stuff that goes beyond the academic. I do recommend tuning into Matt Reinbold, who has a API newsletter called Net Notes, I believe. And it is he runs the API Center of Excellence at Capital One. And so he's got the really deep dive into how you do governance, how you don't do governance. And he's got regular stories coming out where he talks about this. Beyond that, APIEvangelist.com, my blog, I do a lot of talking about this. You can kind of wade through some of that. But again, I apologize. We'll work on this with Postman and be talking about it in wider context, because that's my role, is to not just focus on Postman, but what does governance mean beyond? All right. How long should I go, you guys? Let's keep going. I'm gonna keep answering questions until I see in Slack someone tells me to stop. There's a lot of good ones here. How many company organizations are part of the OpenAPI initiative at the moment? I believe Postman was the 36th, and I believe one or two more have been added since then. So it's pushing 40. But I think the bulk of that is to really show the relevance of it is you got IBM on there, you got Microsoft on there, you got Google on there. These aren't just you got the heavy hitters on there. But I would also say it's not just about the membership, it's about the adoption of the spec. And if you look at the current tech blogosphere, you'll see GitHub just published their OpenAPI definition for the GitHub platform. They're using it for generating SDKs. They're using it behind their docs. They're going all in on OpenAPI internally and externally. Is there an integration with Apigee? No, but Apigee does have a collection in the Postman API network. So when you're in Postman, click on the new button in the top corner, go to the network, type Apigee, and you will see a collection for them. So they are a network partner. And if there are features in there you would like to see deeper integrated into Postman, please submit a GitHub issue. And we're happy to consider deeper integration with Apigee. We're looking at API management solutions like that and how we can do a little bit better in those areas. Can you share a test script across collection? And can you create custom library for custom functions? So you cannot share currently across collections. Within a collection, you can have a test script on a folder or at the collection level that gets applied across requests. But right now, there is no way to, that I'm aware of, to use it across collections. So you got to get creative in how you use the Postman API to pull, distribute, centralize those scripts that are used. And again, I would love to hear from you as far as what you would like to see when it comes to being able to reuse scripts. One thing that I will note is we have a CLI tool that was created by Matt on our solutions team that allows you to sync your scripts with your IDE. So you can sync, edit, and work with those scripts in Visual Studio, and it'll sync it back using the Postman API. And this would kind of set the stage. I see you could do some interesting things with script reuse. Yeah, it looks like my team's telling me I did skip out there a little bit. I apologize. The internet was very good for most of it. So I'm going to take that as a sign. I'm going to look through the rest of the questions. If there's any others, I'll answer those publicly in some blogs. And I appreciate everyone being here today. Hopefully you learned a little bit. And feel free to head over to Union Fashion if you want to look at how some of this is working. I'm easy to find online, Ken Lane or API Evangelist. And of course, get Postman on Twitter. Feel free to hit us with more questions and we'll see about answering them. Thanks, everyone.